The Second Voice by Man Rubin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hannah Harris. The Second Voice by Man Rubin. Crawford completed the rehearsal in less than an hour. He listened to the orchestra run through its selections, okayed the song the guest vocalist had chosen, then finished up with a long dialogue between Spud and himself. When it was over, he checked timing with the program director, made a few script changes, and conferred briefly with the special service officer about the number of troops the auditorium could hold. Everything was running smoothly. It was going to be a neat, action-packed show. Backstage, he looked at his watch. He had almost 2 hours before the regular show began, and he was restless. 2 hours at Harlow Field could seem like 2 years. Guards and restrictions all over the place. Harlow Field was the largest experimental base in the world, a veritable garden of atoms, the proving ground for every secret weapon ever imagined. The security and the tight regulations gave Crawford the jitters on each of his visits. He smoked a cigarette and tried making small talk with some of the soldiers on backstage detail. He posed for a picture and gave an interview to a reporter from an army newspaper, then excused himself and went to his dressing room with Spud propped in the crook of his arm. He was used to it now, the applause, the audiences, the pictures, the autographs, the fuss. Everywhere the response was the same. They had either seen him in the movies or on television or in the nightclubs where he first broke in his act. Now they wanted to establish an identity with him, to touch the merchandise, to stand close so that they could write home about the visiting celebrity. Crawford was a realist. It was all part of being a name. It had taken him just 5 years to make the big time. 5 years of road shows, coast-to-coast tours, one-night stands, and a dummy named Stud to make him the hottest ventriloquist in the business. His act was tight, well-paced, and popular. He had a weekly radio show, a television program, and a 7-year contract with a major Hollywood studio. He was riding high. Still, he hadn't forgotten the soldiers. 2 months each year he took time off to travel the USO circuit. His agent tore his hair, reminding him of the financial losses, but the USO had given him his first break, so he had always answered their call. He liked enthusiastic audiences, and the cheering of laugh-hungry men made him happy. Entertainment was his business, and he enjoyed exhibiting his talent. The wider the audience, the better he liked it. His dressing room was located back of the auditorium. He closed the door behind him, put Spud on a chair, and began getting out of his rehearsal clothes. He lit a cigarette and looked at himself in the mirror. He was tired and needed a shave. In the last week the pace had been fast. The USO tour still had a few days to run, but he was looking forward to its end. A vacation, the luxury of relaxation, would all be his then. He opened a drawer of the dressing table and pulled out a bottle of scotch. There were 2 hours to be killed before the show. He drank a shot and thought about it. A shower, a shave, a good dinner, and a walk around the base would consume the time. After the show, he would drive back to town and check in at a hotel for a good night's sleep. He was putting the bottle back in the drawer when a knock sounded at the door. He said, "Come in," thinking it was one of the cast, and didn't turn around. He heard the door open, glanced into the mirror, and glimpsed Colonel Meadows, the commanding officer of Harlow Field, and a man in civilian clothes he didn't recognize. He turned around, reached for a bathrobe. "Don't mind us, Robbie," said the colonel. "Just dropped by to say hello." He was a small, plump man, and his face was always red and perspiring. Crawford knew him slightly from the other times he had played Harlow Field, but this was the first time the colonel had ever paid him a backstage visit. "Got a fan here who wants to meet you," continued the colonel. "Shake hands with Dr. Paul Schalt, one of our best scientists. He and I just caught your rehearsal. Fine, very fine." The doctor's name struck a chord, and Crawford dug deep until it focused. Dr. Paul Schalt was a physicist working with the Army. He specialized in the development of radar, was the chief developer of the electronic detonator used in atomic bombs. I enjoyed your performance very much, said Dr. Schall. Your voice is extraordinary. He had a smooth, angular face, black hair, and black, penetrating eyes. Amazing range. Thanks, said Crawford. And the clearness of tone is phenomenal, said Dr. Schall. Has it always been like that? Crawford nodded. When I was a kid it embarrassed me, my voice, he said, smiling. A trick voice, everybody called it. But it's a definite asset to a practitioner of the art of ventriloquism. You should have seen Dr. Schall while you were on stage, said Colonel Meadows, beaming at him. He was running all over the auditorium testing your voice with one of his gadgets. Crawford grinned. I didn't realize I moved my audience so. Dr. Schall laughed. What Colonel Meadows says is true. I'm very interested in your vocal range. While you rehearsed, I tested the quality and sound of your tone. He stopped, looked around the room until he discovered Spud where Crawford had put him on the table. He walked over to the dummy and touched the wooden head with his hand. Actually, it's a second voice. That sound and vibration you used for Stud. It's perfect for what I need, that second voice. Dr. Schall put the dummy back in the position he had found him in, reached into his pocket and brought out a small glass enclosed instrument, which he held in front of him. Do you know what this is? He asked, approaching the dressing table. Never saw it before, Crawford said, examining the gadget. A small arrow flickered nervously within a glass cage. It's called a voice oscillator, explained Dr. Schall. It's sensitive to the slightest tonal inflection. We use it to measure the pitch and volume of a human voice. What's all this got to do with me? Crawford asked. We want to use the voice of Spud for an experiment. A very important experiment. With your permission, we'd like to do it immediately. I'm afraid that's impossible, said Crawford. I have a show in about... Our equipment is all set up, interrupted the doctor. The entire test will take 45 minutes. We'll have you back in no time. Crawford frowned. He was tired, and he looked forward to relaxing a while before the show. Couldn't we make it some other time, he said. The colonel spoke then. Robbie, do you remember reading 4 years ago that our radar system was able to beam signals to the moon and have them returned? Sure, said Crawford. It got a big play in all the newspapers. Well, our scientists are now ready to conduct a similar experiment, said Colonel Meadows. This time to Mars. To Mars? Repeated Crawford, wondering what it had to do with him. Only this time we plan to send a voice. A human voice that can travel through interstellar space, said Dr. Schall. But that's impossible, Crawford exclaimed. With the average voice, yes, said Dr. Schall. Cosmic disturbances would drown out a normal voice amplified 1,000 times beyond its regular frequency. But a voice in a higher octave, like your second voice. Well, we believe there's a certain resonant intonation which can be curved and regulated in any direction. In the voice you use for your dummy. Crawford nodded. Spud's voice contains that quality, continued Dr. Schall. I believe it can reach Mars and bounce back. I'm asking you to be the first man ever to throw his voice to another planet. There was quiet for a moment when he finished. Crawford's cigarette had gone out, and he relit it. The smoke steadied him. Outside in the auditorium the orchestra had begun to rehearse again. Where's the station set up? Asked Crawford finally. It's right here on the field, Robbie, Colonel Meadows said quickly. We've had it under wraps for the last 8 months. It'll be a tremendous thing if it works. Crawford dragged on his cigarette a last time and stamped it out. He walked over to Spud, lifted the dummy into position in the crook of his arm. What do you say, Crawford? Asked Dr. Schall. There was a note of urgency in his voice. I don't know, said Crawford slowly. My crazy voice is my bread and butter. Can't you use somebody else? Somebody whose voice isn't his life? We've wasted weeks testing every man on this field, said Dr. Schall solemnly. The average voice becomes static as soon as it gets past Earth's atmosphere. But your voice can break through. I've studied every vibration, every quiver of it. It bends and flexes with each cosmic pressure. You must let us try. Crawford looked at Colonel Meadows. Robbie, I promise you there's no danger involved, the colonel said. There's been a great deal of time and effort put into this project, and we'd like to see it work.